Thank you so much for joining us to learn a little bit more about how you and your organization can effectively engage in the upcoming federal election. We're broadcasting today from Ottawa on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin. Our presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory and uphold and uplift the voices and values of our host nation. Before I introduce you to the brilliant minds that join us today, thank you to the Climate Action Network, Cooperation Canada, and the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health. Without your leadership, this session simply wouldn't have been possible. Simultaneous translation is also available, and you can listen in French or English by selecting your preferred option at the bottom of your screen. So how do you get involved in the election? This can be a daunting question. With multiple sets of rules outlined in multiple pieces of legislation, it can often feel easier just to pull back during an election campaign and say nothing. But silence doesn't create change. So joining me today are two brilliant minds who are going to help demystify the regulations for nonprofits and charities and talk about the steps that you and your organization can take to engage in this election season. Mark Blumberg is a partner in the law firm Blumberg Segal, and works almost exclusively advising nonprofits and registered charities on their work in Canada and abroad. He is particularly interested in the regulation of nonprofits and charities in Canada, philanthropy, transparency requirements for the voluntary sector, providing accessible information on regulatory issues, and the use of data to make more informed decisions on the charity sector. From Dalhousie University, John Cameron is Associate Professor and Graduate Program Director in the Department of International Development Studies. One of the key focuses of his research is on representations of global development and poverty in Canada and the efforts of Canadian NGOs to engage the Canadian public in global justice issues. Before I turn the virtual floor over to John, a couple of housekeeping items. We welcome anyone who is registered as a third party in past elections to share their experiences. If you would kindly add your name and organization to the chat that you would like to share some of those personal stories, we'll be looking to you at the end of the presentation to share a little bit of your own insights and the impact it's had on your organization and how that led into the role you played during the election. Second, our panel is going to have a little bit of time at the end to answer questions. However, extreme detailed, nuanced questions are hard to answer without doing additional research and background work. So they won't be able to tackle anything that goes deep into nuance. But issues that broadly affect different organizations throughout the sector, please feel free to add those questions into the chat. We'll start to work through those once at the end of the presentation. And there's also a Q&A document that is going to be circulated in the coming days that does deal with some of those more nuanced pieces. We're just doing some updates to it right now. But as I said, please add your questions into the chat. Please let us know if you have personal stories that you'd like to share. We very much want to be able to hear from you. Now, to kick off our session today, John has some interesting reflections on previous sector engagement in past elections. Over to you, John.
Okay. So first of all, thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. I'm John Cameron at Dalhousie University, and I'm joining you from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people.
des Micmacs. Je vais faire
very, very briefly what Mark and I are planning to share with you today. So for organizations that are engaged in efforts to change public policies in Canada, there are three particularly important sets of federal regulations for those organizations to pay attention to. For charities, there are the CRA regulations, the Canada Revenue Agency regulations on public policy dialogue and development activities, or so-called PPDDAs, which replaced the regulations on political activities in 2019. There are also the federal lobbying rules and the Elections Canada regulations for third-party advertising around elections. Mark is going to speak in more detail about the regulations themselves in a few minutes. I'm going to start us off by sharing some data and very brief analysis of that data from the 2019 federal election. And this is data on the engagement of so-called third parties in public policy issues in the lead up and during the election campaign in 2019. Skip through that. So just first off, I'll highlight that the source of all of this data is from Elections Canada. And this is also a way of highlighting that if your organization registers with Elections Canada and reports spending on so-called third-party advertising to Elections Canada, the data will be publicly available. So people like me can see it, we can share it, we can analyze it. And Elections Canada does, I think, quite a good job of making this data easily accessible and easily understandable. So here's where the numbers are coming from. At a really high level, so what I'm speaking about now are the organizations, the Elections Canada data on organizations that registered with Elections Canada and reported spending money on so-called political advertising with Elections Canada in the lead up and during the 2019 federal election campaign. The basic rule, which Mark is going to speak about in more detail, is that any organization that spends money to boost its public policy perspectives, spends more than $500, must register with Elections Canada. And then there is also a requirement, depending on how much money an organization spends, to submit a series of reports. So based on that data from Elections Canada in 2019, we know that 147 third-party organizations registered. 129 of those were nonprofits, 9 were registered charities, 9 were individual citizens, and they reported spending a total of $111 million. I want to dig into the specific sectors of organizations that are here on the call today. So what you're seeing now is a high-level overview of the 147 organizations that registered. You'll see that there were 18 environmental organizations that I can't see the number, but you can probably see it, how much they spent, because I've got messages on my screen, but you can see what environmental organizations spent. There were 8 health organizations and health lobby groups that registered. They spent a total of about $550,000. There were 4 international social justice, international development organizations. 3 of those were Cooperation Canada members. Collectively, they spent a total of $23,000. I'm going to share, this is all public information, so I'm not doing this in any way to embarrass organizations, but rather to congratulate them for engaging with public policy issues and promoting public policy debate during the campaign, but also so that other organizations know who they can reach into for experience on the registration and reporting process. So here you see the spending levels from the 18 environmental organizations that registered, starting with the high spender was Protect Our Winters Canada at $237,000, and then working down in spending limits. The 3 international Cooperation Canada members that registered were Oxfam Canada, UNICEF Canada, and Amnesty International. The English section, you can see their spending levels there. And then health organizations, I'm not sure if any of these are CanWaCH members, but you can see there the spending levels for those 8 organizations. There are just a few key points I want to make before I turn things over to Mark. One of them is I think a fairly obvious point, that election campaigns are clearly a prime opportunity for civil society organizations to engage the public on public policy issues. Many CSOs, both nonprofits and charities, include references to public policy work in their mission statements. And yet, what this data shows us is that relatively few organizations are registering with Elections Canada, or at least in 2019, relatively few organizations registered with Elections Canada to report spending on political advertising to boost their positions in public policy debates. And I think that leads us to two possible conclusions. The first conclusion is that there are organizations that are spending money on political advertising, but they're not registering with Elections Canada and they're not reporting to Elections Canada. And I would argue, and I think Mark will very much point out, that this is very dangerous. It can lead to hefty fines as well as possible jail time. So if your organization is spending money on political advertising, you need to register and you need to report. The other conclusion is that there are organizations that are simply self-silencing, they're self-censoring during the election campaign. And I think this is also particularly worrisome. There are many organizations that include public policy engagement, public policy work in their mission statements and their objectives, and yet they're self-silencing on that mission during, in the lead up to and during an election campaign, which I think suggests that there's an abrogation or a failure to play the role that civil society organizations should be playing in a democratic society, which is to engage the public in critically thinking about and debating important public policy issues. I want to share before I end three observations based on conversations with civil society organizations around the Elections Canada registration. The first is, I guess, a reflection on what seems to be a perception that the fact that certain activities are regulated by Elections Canada does not mean that those activities are prohibited. It simply means that organizations need to register and need to report. And yet there seems to be a widespread perception that regulation essentially is a prohibition, that if something is regulated, you ought to avoid it. There seem to be widespread fears that political advertising and then registering with Elections Canada and reporting to Elections Canada is essentially a risky activity, that it would somehow get you into trouble, could get an organization into trouble, that it might somehow trigger audits from the CRA. To the best of my knowledge, there is no evidence that registering with Elections Canada has triggered auditing from the CRA. Mark can probably speak to that better than I can. But again, I think those fears are, they're very present. I think they're overstated. And then a third observation is that there seems to be a widespread concern with figuring out how to avoid registering and reporting, primarily by avoiding so-called regulated activities, rather than simply registering, reporting, and getting on with public policy work. So I'll end there and turn things over to Mark.
Thank you very much, John. That was superb. And yeah, I think it'll be really good to discuss the sort of three areas that charities need to be aware of when we're talking political activities, especially around the time of an election. I'll just point out, we have a site, charitydata.ca, which has information on every charity going back about 17 years. And you might want to check it out. It has a section on political activities that charities have conducted. And in fact, very few charities identify that even in the old rules before the changes in 2018, that they did political activities. About 700-800 were saying that they were doing it. And the amounts they were spending, about 30 million, was tiny amounts of money, especially when you realize how much money goes into politics in Canada. So the three sets of rules, as John mentioned, the Income Tax Act deals with limitations on registered charities. This set of rules right now with the changes doesn't impose any limitations on how much you can do. The only limitations in terms of what you can do really relates to that it can't be what we used to call partisan, or indirectly or directly supporting a particular candidate or political party. So that's the first set, is dealing with the Income Tax Act. The second set here with the third-party advertising with Elections Canada is really similar to the lobbying one. It's just a registration system. You can do it and you can do lots of it, but you need to register. Whereas lobbying, there is no limit really on the amount of lobbying. With the third party stuff, yeah, if you get up to like $500,000, you're going to get into limits, but we're not, no organization I'm aware of is anywhere close to anything like that. So I don't think really there's any real limits that apply to the typical organization. But so they're different. These are essentially different sets of rules, and one should understand them, because there could be some nonprofits on this webinar, and to the extent that they're nonprofits, the part here we're talking about registered charities doesn't apply to you. Okay, but the other two parts about lobbying and potentially third-party election advertising will apply to you. So keep that in mind as well. But the old rules, I won't dwell on them. They largely focused on groups being able to spend between 10 and 20%, depending on their size of their resources, on what were referred to as sort of allowable political activities in the old days. Okay, but those rules have been replaced. In fact, many groups, just so that you know, a small group can, if they haven't spent any money, could actually, under the old rules, spend 60% in a particular year because they average it over 3 years. So a small group could, they had lots of room under the old rules to do political activities, and very few groups, unfortunately, did. But now the rules have been opened up. So a charity literally can spend 100% of its money on what are called public policy dialogue and development activities, or PPDDAs. Okay, and this was as of 2018. Now, so essentially, it's not that charities can do anything they want as a registered charity. They need to do these public policy, or if they wish to do public policy dialogue and development activities, they can do it, but it has to be connected to their what are called stated charitable purposes. Okay, so what is stated purposes? We'll talk about it, but it's more than just what is in your objects, but that's the first place to start to work out stated charitable purposes. And then I use the terminology, the old terminology of you can't be directly or indirectly partisan. CRA prefers what is in the act to say that essentially you can't be directly or indirectly supporting a candidate or a political party, but that's a lot of words, and I think people understand the concept of partisan versus just being involved with the political activity. So saying that you would like to spend more money on ODA, it would be a political activity, or now what we call a PPDDA. But if you said we need to get rid of the Liberal government because they will never spend more on foreign activities, then I think that would be a partisan statement that would be inappropriate for a charity to make. Okay, and many charities also had nonprofits on the side, which allowed them to do even partisan political activities. So it's not hard if one wanted to do partisan activities. You just can't use charitable resources for that partisan work. Now, although PPDDAs are not defined in the Income Tax Act, what essentially they are is what we used to refer to as nonpartisan, allowable nonpartisan political activities. So what is a stated charitable purpose? Because any PPDAs you want to do have to be related to your stated charitable purposes. The first thing is you look in your governing documents, your articles, your letters patent, your trust deed, whatever, and you would see what are the purposes that are in there. Okay, now there are some other stipulations that the purposes also fall within one of the 4 categories of charity. And the reason this is important is that many groups that were set up, let's say more than 10 years ago, their objects may not be by current standards, by, CRA has a guidance on what you should be putting into objects. They wouldn't meet those current standards. Okay, so this, because you might have had objects from 30 years ago that are very broad, it doesn't mean that they'll be appropriate from a CRA perspective in terms of actually fitting within the 4 heads of charity and not being broad or vague that CRA has an issue with. Okay, the other thing just to keep in mind, but let's say your objects say to help people in Rwanda or something like that, that are poor, then obviously you can't go beyond your objects. You can't be then focusing in on helping people in a different country because your objects were narrow. They're very much, but that's something that can be changed. You can go back to CRA. It takes about 3 to 4, 5 months sometimes to get their approvals for different objects. So I'm just mentioning that's something very much in your control. And it's the biggest impediment right now for a charity to conduct political activities is that their objects are not broad enough to allow for the types of political activities they want. And many foundations that just have a simple object that says to make gifts to qualified donees, they're actually not allowed to do any political activities, is my understanding of CRA's position, because they don't have an object that allows them. It's not to advance education through programming, in which case then you could do political activities on education. Okay, and then the third piece, which is interesting, and we'll see how this plays out, but it has to provide a public benefit. So the activities that you're doing, they'll look at it and say, if it's causing more harm than good, then actually it's not an appropriate PPDDA to be involved with. Okay, so that's just the 3 pieces that go into stated charitable purposes. It's a little bit broader than just saying what are our purposes in our governing documents. You also have to look at, are these within the four heads of charity? And then also, is there a public benefit? And then CRA has some documents up there and some other information, which is quite helpful, that you can take a look at, including their main guidance, CG 27, on these public policy dialogue and development activities. Now, there's, I think John said when it came to the likelihood of CRA audit based on, filing, registering in terms of the Elections Act, that there's there's a tremendous concern. I would say in many cases, there is, too much concern when it comes to political activities. This has always been the case. Until the Harper audit period, there was very little that was going on relating to political activities. And even then, it was 52 charities that were caught up in that out of about 5,000 that were audited over that period. So a lot of concern about it. The question is, what does one do about it? And so when CRA is coming in right now, they're definitely not looking at whether you're spending 10 or 12 or 14% of your money on political, because that's not relevant anymore. What they'll be looking at is stuff that you're doing partisan, directly or indirectly partisan. They'll look at, what are your objects? Is it outside the objects? And more importantly, to be very frank, they'll be looking at the other top 20 issues if they're looking at your organization, if it's a registered charity, okay? So as I mentioned before, I think many groups should look at their purposes over the next while. They should think about whether they should be expanded, enhanced, etc. And then the other thing is, CRA has about 20 things that they're very interested in. And I would suggest that if you're going to be doing, especially things that are very controversial relating to political activities, that you really look at those issues. So things that have a fundraising guidance dealing with fundraising, if you do fundraising. If you're issuing receipts, how are you doing it? Most charities don't do it correctly, and it's much easier for CRA to have a problem with a charity on receipting than it is on political and other things. The T3010s, on the weekend, I found $12 billion worth of mistakes in 2 filings from 2 charities. 12 billion, that's a lot of mistakes. If you make mistakes, if it's just a mistake and wasn't deliberate, they can suspend your receipting for a year. That means you can't issue receipts and you can't get gifts for a year from foundations and things. But the budget 2021, the Liberals brought in, I don't even know why they did this, but they basically upped it to say that, oh, if you're deliberately putting something in the T3010 that is incorrect, you can be revoked for that. Anyway, so just pointing out, T3010s should be scrutinized far more than they are. We are finding in about 90% of T3010s that we look at that there are mistakes in them, and many of them are quite easy to just not make that mistake, okay? But what are your objects? Are your activities under your objects? Are they undue private benefits? Are you doing business activities that are inappropriate? Are you dealing with, because many of these groups are doing with foreign activities, or you're dealing with nonprofits in Canada, the rules around direction and control to make sure that you're complying with those rules. So that's on the political side in terms of CRA, the Income Tax Act. That applies to registered charities only, not to nonprofits. Then when it comes to any organization and we have an election, we have to worry about third-party election advertising registration rules, okay? And so basically, these rules are at the federal level. They're also in some provinces. And the scope of the rules is getting greater over time. So I'm not going to talk about Ontario, but we have an election in Ontario next year. And now these rules are covering a period of 1 year before the election, which is huge. So are you going to be quiet, not doing anything that would be considered advertising relating to issues relating to the Ontario election for a whole year because you're not going to take the step of registering? That would be really unfortunate if that was the case, okay? So just keep in mind that this same discussion is going to be going on and on and on, not just with the federal election, but provincial elections that are happening all over the place. And most charities don't realize that these rules can easily apply to them, same with nonprofits. Now, the good thing about these rules is they are only during the election and sometimes for a period prior to the election, okay? So it's only for a circumscribed period of time, but like I mentioned in Ontario, that period has now become a year. And there's very low thresholds for registration. So for example, at the federal level, it's $500. So that's definitely something that one has to look at. So we have the Canada Elections Act. And basically a third party it's basically any group that isn't a political party or one of these, candidates, etc. Okay, so it includes a lot of charities, potentially a lot of nonprofits, for-profits, other things. So nonprofits that are not registered charities and Canadian charities may fall under the definition of a third party. Nonprofits that are registered charities are going to be, it'll affect them slightly differently. But just keep in mind that the Canada Elections Act doesn't really make a distinction between being a registered charity versus a nonprofit. And CRA has made it very clear in the last election, in the lead up to it, that they see no problem with Canadian charities registering, that although some groups that are registering are doing partisan activities that charities are not allowed to do, but the definition of what is needed, as we'll discuss, is broad enough that many charities should be registering under this system. And as John pointed out, only, I think it was 4 in total had registered, which is very unfortunate. So basically, the main difference between 2019 and 2021, if this election is called, and people are talking about how maybe in August it'll be called, is that was a fixed election in 2019. So different rules applied. We have a not fixed date election. So let's say it's called at some point in August. It'll be at least, my understanding is 35 to 50 days. And that's how much time period will be covered by these set of rules this time. So whenever it's basically called, when the writ is dropped, whatever, until the election happens, that's the period that these regulated activities will be looked at. Okay. So basically, there's 3 types of activities. There's election advertising, partisan activities, election surveys, okay? If you're a nonprofit, all of these could be relevant to you. If you're a registered charity, election advertising, part of it is probably the main thing that's relevant, and maybe election surveys, but you won't be doing partisan activities, okay? But the key thing in definition here is to understand, and this is during the election period. So let's say it's called, for that 35 to 50 days before the election, that's the election period. If you take a position on an issue with which a registered party or person is associated, and between the different candidates, the different parties, a lot of things are covered by, some candidate or party has taken a position on something, and so this can be relevant. The partisan wouldn't be relevant for charities, as I mentioned. Election surveys, they can be done by charities, but you have to be careful how you do them. You can't do them as some nonprofits can do them, because they could be construed as being partisan. So mostly I'm going to focus on just the election advertising, because that's the most likely thing. Keep in mind, there's a distinction between, we've talked about nonprofits versus registered charities. Now, obviously, registered charities are a type of nonprofit, but they're under the Income Tax Act viewed as being essentially a special type of nonprofit. There's also this concept of charity, not a registered charity. So this would be like a small church. It's not a registered charity, but it could still be a charity. And under provincial jurisdiction, certain groups are considered charities, even if they're not registered charities. They can't issue official donation receipts under the Income Tax Act, etc. But just keep in mind that even if you're either a charity or a registered charity, you probably shouldn't be involved with partisan activities. Okay. So what is election advertising? The transmission to the public by any means during the election period of an advertising message that promotes or opposes a registered party or candidate, including by taking a position on any issue with which a party or candidate is associated. So as I mentioned, the first part will not be relevant to charities because you can't really promote or oppose a registered party or candidate, but you can take a position on something which, so if there was one party that was saying there's no such thing as climate change, you can quite easily take a position that there is climate change, obviously, and then you would basically go forward with that. Some parties might have committed to increasing ODA. Others might not have a position on it, okay? But you can certainly have a position that it should be doubled or whatever you want to have as a position, okay? So examples, you're hiring a media firm to design election advertising that'll be distributed during the election period. So that's where it's not just the paying for the actual advertising, but you're actually paying for the people to design it and all that. Having your own staff produce election advertising messages that are going to be on radio, TV, newspapers, magazines, website, banners, billboards, etc. Paid, sponsored, or boosted messages communicated over the internet is probably the most common thing. Many charities regularly will boost their tweets and other things. So as we'll talk about what is not election advertising, we'll go on to that in the next slide. It gives you an idea of what you can do that doesn't mean that you have to register. But I think that I would go back to John's very important point about registration and regulation versus prohibition. I'm suggesting that charities, especially the ones who wish to do quite a bit of political work, that they, as a matter of course, start registering when it comes up, whether it's provincially or federally, when there's the possibility that their views could be made known and you want to not be too limited in how you do it. But you can definitely do a lot without registering. So for example, using free social media platforms, as many charities do, Twitter, Facebook, etc. So it's free. And you're putting it up there, no problem. People are following because they want to follow, but that's very different than boosting or billboards or banner advertising on things. But if you want to have amplified the voices you have, for many groups, the only way they can really do it is through paying and spending some money. And because the threshold is only $500, it's pretty low. One can chew through that very quickly. Messages sent through email or other messaging system. So if you want to send a message to 100 or even 10,000 people, that's fine. You can send messages, and that isn't going to be considered election advertising by Elections Canada. Videos posted for free on social media platforms such as YouTube or Instagram. So the same as tweets. If you're putting up videos, things like that, no problem. This sort of free stuff is not a problem. And then even content posted on third-party websites, and where you're not paying for it. So the ongoing expenses for creating and maintaining a website are not placement costs, okay? So if you have your own website, there's nothing wrong with that. So you can put up your own content on the website. And the basic idea is there's a lot of stuff that isn't included in regulated activities. So you can go ahead and do these in the normal course. But going back to where you're doing things, where you're sponsoring, boosting, etc., that will kick in with the registration requirements. Okay. So here's just an example of election advertising, a third party. So it could be a charity, it could be some sort of nonprofit that is really sort of like a political party, you know, in terms of you know exactly where they're coming from. They run a national radio ad campaign during the election period, promoting a policy issue with which they're closely associated. Okay, this is election advertising. The advertising has to include authorization statement from the third party, the expenses for the advertising, so the scripting, the recording, the transmission, all the expenses basically have certain limits. But like I said, the limits are quite a bit, although it's also, there's limits based on each riding. So if you're focused on one riding, that might be a low limit of about 5,000. But if you're doing it across Canada, you've got hundreds of thousands of dollars you can spend without hitting the limits. And none of the charities that I'm aware of are anywhere close to that. And I think John's data points that out as well. So give me 1 second here. So basically, when do you have to register? If you're going to do, and there is no pre-election period here, there's only the election period, that 35 days before the election. But if you're going to spend $500 or more on regulated activities, then you need to be registered, okay? And, you know, obviously it's not foreign entities that can register. They shouldn't be involved in our election. It's Canadian citizens, it's businesses here in Canada, groups that are here in Canada, things like that, okay? So during a fixed election period, which we're not in, there's certain starting dates because you know ahead of time when things are going to happen. In this particular case, we don't know when the election is going to get called, but as soon as it gets called, at that point, that's when the $500 clock starts running. And there are some exceptions to it, like if you'd already ordered, you know, 6 months of advertising, it's going to happen every week. There are some exceptions to the rule. If it's non-cancelable, in some cases, you won't have to register, even though you did spend some money. But that wouldn't apply to things that you're spending because there's an election going on deliberately. Okay. So basically, there's a few things that need to be done. One of them is to open up a separate bank account to be able to put money in that is going to be used for these expenses. It's always a hassle to open up a separate bank account, but the good news is that you can take that separate bank account and then use it again later when, for example, you're flipping over to wanting to spend money later. Once you've finished off with the federal election, you go and you use it for the Ontario election, or you use it for something else later. So you know, you set it up once and you have it. You have to appoint a financial agent. And then if you're going to spend more than $10,000, and I can't remember from John's whether any charity spent more than 10,000, but most were spending under 10,000, then you have more reporting and there's more onerous, there's more work that needs to be done. But even that isn't so bad. It's basically just that you're going to have an auditor who's going to prepare a report and file that. Okay. And then there's a general third-party form that is filed. The other thing to keep in mind is you need to have a resolution. You can't just as a program officer or CEO decide, hey, I think this is a great idea, Mark, let's go register. You need to have basically the board authorizing it. And here's a sample sort of resolution. But because that's the case, you need to think a little bit ahead, because you don't want to have, oh, 1 week into the election, you decide, oh, we really have to get involved with this. Then it takes you a while to get your board together. You're losing a lot of time. So you're probably better off to discuss with the board sooner rather than later, to try and get a board resolution that empowers you to do the registration if you need to. There's certain taglines also I won't go into in detail, because in fact there's a very helpful guide by Elections Canada that you can look at with a lot of detailed information. The $500, these are just some other points, is not just cash, but also could be donated supplies and services that are valued at sort of commercial value. And so you've just got to watch that. You need to also report. So some organizations, when they're spending this $5,000 or $10,000 or $20,000, they're just going to take money from general expenses, and that's fine. But some are going to do special fundraising for this, and then they will need to report on each contributor over $200. If you ask me, if you don't need to, it's just easier to take money from your general sources and just use it for this work, and then you don't need to report on these contributors, because they're not giving for this campaign. It's just your own money, basically. And I think with the ones that I looked at for most of the charities, that was how they had done it. And keep in mind that you can take contributions from certain sources, but you can't from others, specifically foreign groups and things like that. Okay, there aren't contribution limits, there are spending limits. Subtle difference, but there's no limit that says a person can only give $500. No, a person can give, whatever they want, but there are some limits on the amount that you can spend. Very important to not use foreign money. Otherwise, you get into all sorts of complicated issues around collusion and prohibitions and other things that are not good. Okay. There are limits as to electoral districts I mentioned, and also nationally, but I think in general, these are very high for most charities, but you can look at that if you want. Okay. So once you spend more than $500 on boosting or advertising or banner ads or any of this stuff, then during that election period that we're going to have in this non-fixed date election, you will need to register. Okay. And then if it's more than 10,000, you will need to do more reporting than you will. So really it means that there's very limited reporting for under $10,000, which is quite good. So the summary of this set of rules is really that the $500 expenditures is a very low limit. And in this case, it'll only be an election period. So it's one $500 amount. If you go over that, you need to register. And now the good news is that the election is going to be shorter, or the period covered, because there is no pre-election period. There's only going to be the election period. So it's 35 to 50 days. So it's almost 2 months. That's better than when you had a fixed election, or we will have maybe a fixed election at some point in the future, where you literally have a 4-month period that you are really circumscribed if you're not going to register. Okay. So some groups may say that it's shorter, they're less worried about it. But I sort of take the view of, you never know when something that's really important to your organization is going to be an election issue. And in fact, it's more likely that it'll be an election issue and listened to in the way that you want it if you're in fact are engaging and doing advertising during the election. So many nonprofits and charities should register. It's a very big problem for a charity if you're not registered, and you should have been registered. And then I said, be careful about foreign money, that sort of thing. The Political Financing Handbook for Third Parties by Election Canada is very useful. You can get it online. It's a PDF. Okay. So that's the second set of rules. And that's what's top of mind, I think, to a lot of people, because we have an election potentially coming down the pipe. But I also just quickly want to mention the lobbyist registration rules at the federal level. They also apply at many provincial levels. So you have the Lobbying Act at the federal level, you have the Commissioner of Lobbying, and you know, these rules, this is a third set of rules that nonprofits and charities just need to be aware of, or I guess third for charities, second for nonprofits. And what it means is if you are doing lobbying activities and they constitute a significant part of the duties of one employee, or would constitute a significant part of the duties of one employee if they were performed by only one employee, then what that means is if you're spending as an organization in any month more than 1/5 of an FTE on lobbying, then you need to register for this. The lobbying rules, the ITA, the income tax rules are very important to keep in mind because they're continuous, ongoing rules. They don't relate to elections or limited time periods. And if you were following the We Charity scandal that happened last year and continues on to some extent, one of the issues that came up was the issue of the lack of registration for lobbying, and it was caused a huge amount of issues, and those aren't even settled yet. Okay, so communication for the purposes of lobbying involves verbal or written or contact with a public office holder, and it's not just, and this is where many people get confused. They think, oh, I met only with the member of parliament or someone for like 1 hour, but it's all the time spent traveling there. It's time spent preparing the documents for it and all that. And before you know it, it adds up pretty quickly. And 1/5 of an FTE is about 4 days a month. So if you have the equivalent, when you put all your staff together, of 4 days per month being spent on these lobbying activities, you need to register. And it's quite comprehensive. And by the way, this isn't a some sort of thing, and I realize some charities are very suspicious about any government involvement in things, but this is about openness and knowing who's meetings with members of parliament and designated public office holders and all these different groups. And quite frankly, let's be frank, very few of the meetings are with charities. It's with for-profit corporations who are very powerful, who are getting to basically mold what the laws and things are going to be like in this country. And do you want to be meeting with politicians or not? And the answer, I think, is most of the time, if you want an impact, you probably should be meeting with them. And if you look at what are the registrable subject matters for the Lobbying Act, it's very broad. So development of any legislative proposal by the Government of Canada or by any member of the Senate or House of Commons, the introduction of any bill or resolution, and whether you want to pass it, you want to defeat it, you want it amended, this is all covered by the lobbyist registration. Making amendments to any regulations under the Statutory Instruments Act, the development or amendment of a policy or program of the Government of Canada, the awarding of a grant, contribution, or other financial benefit by or behalf of Canada. So a lot of different things are covered by the lobbyist registration rules. And as I mentioned, the significant part of a duty, 1/5 of an FTE, 20%, and for many groups that have a large number of staff people in a particular month, they may very well exceed that. There are some exceptions to registration that are listed here. So it's not every time you're interacting with government, but it's certainly, certain types of interactions. And keep in mind that the stakes are pretty high. It's not that you won't get your status revoked necessarily, because that's CRA, that's not the Commissioner of Lobbying, but you could have the RCMP investigating you. You can go to jail. There's a lot of consequences here. So it's very important to make sure that you're following these rules. And communications, what does it include? And where it's not requiring registration. So some things where you're not, for example, is communication with respect to the enforcement, interpretation, or application by a public office holder of any current federal statute or regulation, just asking them, does this mean this? Does this mean that? And also preparation or presentation of briefings to a parliamentary committee, which are usually going to be public anyway. So the feeling is they don't need to be covered by the Lobbying Act. Just so that you know, there is a register. You can go in, you can search the lobbying database, you can see what other groups are doing. I always say to a charity that if you're interested in public policy, you're interested in all this stuff, you really should be thinking about getting on the registry, because you hopefully will be having enough meetings and other things and communications that it'll be necessary. But also it's, although not many people look at this database, it's a bit of an advertisement. These are the groups that really are having the meetings and in the know in many cases and things like that. So very much worth taking a look there. And then just on some ethical issues, charities both need to, in my mind, get involved with political activities when it's important for their mission. Some charities, there may be an argument that it's not, but for many it is. But also keep in mind that the greatest asset you have for fundraising and everything else is your reputation. So be careful about what you do get involved with. In other words, be strategic about it. Don't just be involved with everything that your friends are involved with. Think about carefully for your organization what you should be involved with and things like that. And I would suggest, because of the importance of it, that you have a policy that just deals with when you will be involved with advocacy. Some groups, their board will decide if something is going to be done. Some will have the CEO decide. What's the process for decision making to make it less likely that you will unintentionally get involved with something that's inappropriate. The biggest problem, are sufficient resources allocated? No, the charity sector was spending 30 million out of its $270 billion on political activities is what they told CRA. So definitely not sufficient resources allocated to this area. And also problems in the past of transparency. Many groups doing a lot of political activities, but saying they're doing none. I think groups should be transparent about the political activities they're doing. And most that I speak to, certainly they're not embarrassed by it, they're proud of it. So there's no reason to not be transparent about it. And then, involvement of stakeholders in choosing the agenda, the direction, and the implementation of it is also important. These are just sort of ethical issues. But if you supposedly trying to do work that's in support of, say, a particular country or something like that, or a group in a country, then it's important that the people there are understanding and agreeing with the types of initiatives that you're doing. And then there's all sorts of silos, and many groups have government relations committees that really just go off and do their own thing, and often it can create some problems for the charity. In 2006, the former Canadian Council for International Cooperation had a benchmark for political activities of 2%, trying to encourage their members to spend 2%. Now it's not being tracked, at least not by CRA, so this will evaporate as we won't have any data on it, unfortunately. But that was when you could only spend 10%. They were begging their members to spend 2%. And there wasn't anything close to 2% being spent by the members. So I think that it's important for charities to allocate resources. For some, 1% will be a lot. For others, it'll be 10 or 15 or 20%, whatever it is. And then avoid the fray of partisan activists and propaganda. We're charities, we should be operating at a higher level. There's a lot of disinformation, misinformation, with especially COVID and things floating around. Some of it's coming from charities. It's very unfortunate. And then here are just some thoughts in terms of different things to ask yourself. I'm not going to go through them, but they're here if you need them, sort of a little bit of a checklist of some questions to ask. And then, if there are any questions that we can answer, we'll try to. And there is also going to be a poll at the end just for you to provide commentary and feedback to the various organizations on the program. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark and John. And we have a couple of folks that have registered in the past, and we're hoping to throw them in the hot seat a little bit to share a bit about their experiences. And so I'm going to go to Caroline, who's very kindly just turned her camera on. Thank you so much. If you wouldn't mind telling us where you're coming from, which organization, and what your experience has been like.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'm Caroline Brouillette, joining from unceded Ganyan-Gehaga territory in what is now called Montreal. I'm the domestic policy manager at Climate Action Network Canada. So I'm going to give a bit of experience as to what it was like for us to register as a third party in 2019, with a caveat that I wasn't at Climate Action Network yet. Tika, who oversees this, is on vacation, but if you have any follow-up questions, please do reach out. So overall, it was a very easy process. It didn't feel onerous for the organizations. That's the echoes that that I've been hearing. You need to involve the auditors if you exceed a certain spending limit, for which the auditor will then also have to provide approval. And we also needed a board resolution to register as a third party. But in the end, it was very much worth it. And we do encourage groups who are thinking about it to reach out to the experts that have very nicely described the issues registering.
Thanks so much, Caroline. And we also have the fabulous Robin. Robin, I don't know, would you mind sharing a little bit about your experience, particularly getting involved in elections and all of that fabulous stuff?
Of course, very happy to. Hello, everyone. My name is Robin. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy with Results Canada. So many of you already know us. Results Canada, we're really about equipping Canadians who care about a world free of extreme poverty to take strategic advocacy action. So we engage in election processes. We haven't registered as an organization before. We don't spend money on any sort of like media campaigning. We use our own owned media channels, and we are pretty fortunate to have a big group of Canadians that are already active as volunteers with us throughout the year. So we educate them about this election, for example. We'll educate them about the election process, why engaging in elections matters. So taking the opportunity to raise your voice for issues that you care about. We all on this call know that a lack of a globally coordinated response and recovery to COVID-19 is really putting us at a dire situation with widening deadly divides around the world. So we'll educate about why now is a really critical moment to raise the issue of wanting to see an increased investment in Canadian aid, and we'll give our volunteers different actions that they can take. So for example, informing themselves, reading the different party platforms, meeting the candidates, going to town halls and asking questions at those town halls. For example, like, will you stand up as a champion for aid if you end up being elected? Those sorts of things. So we are all registered lobbyists, though. The staff at Results Canada are, and our amazing parliamentarian manager, Neha, who I think is on the line today, she takes care of logging any of our activities that need to be logged within that database and making sure that we are all up to spec in terms of knowing what our roles and responsibilities are and how we can operate within our roles. So I'll leave it at that, but I will encourage everyone on this call, like, in addition to working for organizations, you're all also individuals, and you can all engage in the election process as individuals as well. So if the election toolkit from Results Canada sounds like of interest to you as individuals, we can share it. And we also all have networks of Canadians who are volunteers for us or interested in the work we do. The for-profit lobby doesn't generally tend to have those individuals willing to advocate on their behalf or on the issues that they're working on, whereas we do. So we can equip individuals to engage in the election process this time around as well and rally the troops, so to speak. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, ladies. I think the moral of the story is that there is a lot that we can do in this election season. It is always safest to register, that there are some pieces that you need to put in place as with any puzzle, but that if you're not planning on any major ad buys, that the sort of process from registration to reporting is not as cumbersome as you may think, and that by utilizing some of the fantastic advice that we've had here today, you can be very successful in that. And so we have a few questions that have come in. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so we're going to get through a couple. And thank you so much to John, who is popping into the chat and answering as many of those as possible as they came in. And so I think one of the clarifications that we saw in a couple areas is, so if your organization is spending less than 20% of their time / money on advocacy, but it is likely that this threshold would be crossed in the future, would the suggestion be to register in anticipation of that?
So I guess that question probably relates to the lobbying registration type question. I would say that you certainly can, and that way you don't have to worry about registering at some point because you will have done it. And there's no problem if you register when you're at 18%, plus you could have made a mistake and maybe you're actually at 22%. But the point is, so I don't see any harm in registering and just getting into the system and getting into the way of doing it. And I also just caution people that it's best to do things like not when it's the high stress of an election. So if you can do something a year before an election and start doing it and getting in the framework, then it's just less that you have to worry about when you have the election coming around. But certainly if groups are going to be spending over 1/5 of an FTE, and that's per month. So in some months you may spend nothing, but in 1 month you're spending the 1/5 of an FTE, then you do need to register. Okay.
Second question that I saw pop up a couple of times related more to smaller organizations. If they're not planning on spending any money in the election, but they might want to be involved in some partisan activities, do they need to register?
Well, keep in mind that it doesn't cover. So first of all, for charities, there is no partisan activity. So if it's a small group or a big group, but it's not a charity, then they could potentially do some partisan activities. But if it's a registered charity, there's no partisan activities, no, not even one statement, let alone any expenditures allowed, okay? But in terms of, you can do partisan activities that are not considered third-party election advertising. So if, for example, you're going to be sending out an email as a nonprofit on something relating to the election, then that's probably not an email. Just you emailing your members or your friends or whatever is not going to be considered to be something that you need to register for. But on the other hand, if you're going to spend over $500 on banner ads or boosting your tweets or I think lawn signs or whatever other things that there's many ways you can advertise. Those things you then would have to register. And again, you're not prohibited. You in fact could do it. You could spend tens of thousands on lawn signs. Just make sure that you're putting in the forms and registering and doing it right. Okay.
Excellent. And I'm going to try and slip one more in. This one was asked early on, and it's, do we know the comparison between how Canadian CSO political engagement looks compared to other countries? And not sure if you can help us out with that one, John, but I thought it was an interesting way to potentially wrap up our discussion.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer. Part of there are obvious differences. The main, I think, comparison for most Canadians is going to be the United States, and the regulations, and Mark can weigh in as well. The regulations in the United States are very different from the Canadian context, so it's really hard to compare. The downside, which I know Mark will also speak to, is all the rules that apply to environmental organizations and social justice organizations also apply to ultra right-wing conservative groups that might be promoting free use of loaded weapons and that sort of thing. So we have to keep in mind that the rules apply to all organizations. There's a lot more freedom in the United States for civil society groups to engage in so-called political advertising during elections. They deal with different regulations than we do. I don't know, Mark, if you want to jump in as well. And
Sure.
There's a whole bunch more questions that just jumped in, but I don't think we'll be able to get
Absolutely. I don't know also the answer, but here's my guess. I would say, if I just had to be a betting person, that, well, certainly in the US, they're spending way more on political and doing a lot more. You can't do less than what we're doing in Canada. I mean, how can you do less than 30 million out of $270 billion spent on political? So you can't be less than what we're doing. We're doing almost nothing. Charities are almost not engaged at all. And if you hang out with 5 charities who are engaged, you might have a different view. But I'm looking at the 86,000 across the board. It's an embarrassment. And we need to do far more on the political side. And the impediments are not the rules. The impediments are usually, it comes down to money. People would rather, funders would rather pay for, giving food to starving children than they would for making sure there's no starving children, because we have governmental action and other things that will prevent it from happening. And we know the limits of charity. So I'm a very big believer in using more political, it's the best money you can spend is political, because the impact you can have with the political, if we got the government of Canada to double the amount of money they're spending on ODA, I mean, that would be far more than, even if you spent $100 million in fundraising, you're not going to raise that level of money, right? So I think it's the best money that groups can spend. We can't do less than we're doing right now. And also, yeah, I am worried about when I look at the US and I look at some of that happening here and media coverage in the last few weeks. of, for example, a group, something they were doing out in Manitoba that was very problematic. I think that there's a lot of negative that can come from political, and I'm seeing a lot of it. And I'm hoping that good groups that are trying to make the world a better place will become far more engaged. And now that they've pushed for opening up the rules, please do try to take use of it, because others that have different views than you will definitely be taking use of it, and we'll end up with a far worse world if we don't really actively engage on this file. Okay.
Thank you both so much. I'm sorry, we are out of time, so I have captured the last couple of questions that have popped up into the chat. I'm going to chat with the gentleman, see if we can potentially get some answers there, but we'll be able to circle back with the folks. We didn't quite get to your questions today, but just a very quick thank you to all of you that joined us today. Thank you to our panelists, Mark and John. You both have been fantastic. Your advice and wisdom has certainly left me with a lot to think about, and I can't wait to just continue working with the sector overall as we embark on our own election plan. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I can't wait to keep chatting about all of this.